Captured by the Russian army during World War II and accused of being a spy for the Vatican, Walter Sisek, a Jesuit priest, spent 23 years in Soviet prisons and the Siberian gulags from 1940 to 1963. With great simplicity he relates the events he lived through, and that led him down a path of great detachment and ever more trusting abandon to Providence, to that interior serenity that preserved him from the arrogance of evil that surrounded him. He tells of his distress, his suffering, but also of the interior progress he made. With faith and the help of divine grace, he realized how all events, even trials, are a gift of providence and the expression of the holy will of God. All throughout these years of isolation and suffering, God gave me an understanding of life and love that only those who have experienced them can understand. Yes, faith without submission masks our desire for control. This arrogance of evil is encountered not only in the Siberian gulags, but also in our own hearts, the closer we move to presumption. Spiritual pride lies at the root of presumption and controls its deceptions. Each one of us requires that trust that acknowledges the ultimate goodness of God, the source of every good, and the source of love itself. It is only out of this ground that we can learn to love in a better way, with that abundant generosity that is always displayed by God, mirrored for us in the actions of Jesus. It is only when we are rooted in God's love, which is kenotic and eternal, that we come to share in that generosity of superabundance. Here there is no scarcity or shortage of resources. All are satisfied, all are fed. It is here that we find the interior serenity in troubled times. At the time of the story of Jesus' feeding of the multitudes, Jesus is himself besieged by an avalanche of complex human needs. These are troubled times. The crowds have arrived, some merely curious, some are ill and diseased. Most are filled with anger and resentment, as an occupied people, downtrodden and abused. Jesus' own life is in peril, and he has glimpsed the horror of his coming murder. Jesus has just heard the news of the brutal killing of his friend and family member, John the Baptist. Jesus is mourning. Today we would probably be encouraged to compassionate leave, to take leave from work and perhaps some weeks of counseling to help us cope. Jesus also feels the need to withdraw, the call to prayer, and heads by boat to a lonely place where he could be alone with his disciples. But the peoples frustrate his plans. Instead of rest and healing, he finds a large crowd. Could you imagine reading, Jesus instructed the 12 to go to the crowd and tell them that the master had just had some bad news and wasn't feeling all that well. Tell the crowd to come back in a few days, so I can have some time out. Instead we read, so he stepped ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he took pity on them and healed their sick. What would you call that? Generosity, compassion, self-forgetfulness? If this had been an exceptional occasion of putting the other first, we might be content to call it something like generosity. Or remember that day when he was looking for peace and quiet, but the crowd was there instead. Wasn't he generous? But from my own experience, I look at Jesus' actions with some awe. There is something here of mad extravagance, of his totally being there for me. Perhaps divine generosity is a better term. Divine generosity is not just something to thank God for. It brings us to worship God. It is a goodness without limits, perhaps best imaged by the 12 baskets full of scrap left over from the miracle that follows. Our scarcity, our little 5 loaves and 2 fish, has become an abundance, feeding all, satisfying all. Jesus is just like that. More, always more, impossibly more patient, more forgiving, more loving, more understanding, more merciful, more self-giving. An encounter with Jesus is always awesome, abundant, divine generosity. The crowds have received more than a free meal. It is a free meal pointing them to the fullness of life sustained, beyond their capacity to purchase. This was the burden of Jesus' entire mission, to lead them and to lead us beyond the merely material, to incorporate the spiritual, true life, and to the full. Isaiah in the first reading cries out with the very words of God, imbued with a kind of desperate longing for our response. O come to the water, all you who are thirsty. Though you have no money, come. Why spend money on what is not bread, your wages on what fails to satisfy? This impassioned invitation from the Lord himself is searching for ears capable of hearing and valuing it, for men, women, and children who have somehow learned to pierce the gaudy brightness of this world's offerings and have glimpsed the eternal beauty and the joy of another way, where all scarcity is replaced by superabundance. Money, wages, they can buy food for this life. For eternal life, we must draw close to the Lord, encounter Jesus, encounter that awesome, abundant, divine generosity. When the crowds have gone, Jesus sends the disciples across to the other side of the lake, and himself goes up into the hills to pray. He shows us the source of the strength and the integration of his inner psychological life. Jesus lets absolutely nothing stand in the way of his prayer. Not a busy day, not a tragedy, not the acclaim of a crowd, not even his death on a cross. Jesus, in fact, died praying. Our little St. Francis shows us also the way. One day, while walking, Francis came across a poor man along the road. Seeing the man's misery, Francis was moved to compassion. He took off the cloak he was wearing and said to his travelling companions, "It is fitting that we should restore this cloak to this poor man, for it is his, and I accepted it only until I should find someone poorer than myself." When his companions objected, Francis persisted. "I should be counted a thief by the great almsgiver were I to withhold that which I wear from him who has greater need than I." The things we have are to be used for the service of the people we encounter. The Lord's Prayer finds us asking for our daily bread, not for tomorrow's bread or next week. Jesus tells us to ask for what we need, nothing in excess. How many of us have much more than we need? How many of us store up goods in attics, basements, garages, and storage units? Prudent saving and good planning we may claim. Yet we are keeping for ourselves that which can be put to better and more immediate use by someone else. How can we honor the memory of St. Francis of Assisi by being instruments of God's expansive generosity in the world, particularly towards those most in need? St. Clare of Assisi might have responded, "We become what we love. and who we love shapes what we become. If we love things, we become a thing. If we love nothing, we become nothing. Imitation is not a literal mimicking of Christ, but rather it means becoming the image of the Beloved, an image disclosed through transformation. This means that we are to become vessels of God's compassionate love for others. How might you and I, as followers of St. Francis of Assisi, be an instrument of God's expansive generosity in our world today? The Lord grant you peace.